What if the sound that saves your soul comes wrapped in rags and desperation? The wind had been rising all afternoon, scraping across the frozen plains like a dull blade. By nightfall, the snow came hard and relentless, coating every fence post and ridge of the Gentry ranch in a white that blinded even the moonlight. Inside the lonely farmhouse, Silas Gentry sat by the stove, listening to the storm claw at the shutters. The sound was almost a comfort now. He'd long since learned to live with the noise of things breaking, both outside and in. 5 winters had passed since he'd buried his wife and baby, yet the ache hadn't dulled. It had simply gone quiet, like an echo swallowed by snow. He was halfway through a cup of cold coffee when it came, the sound that would change everything. 3 knocks, soft, uncertain, almost polite. For a moment Silas thought he'd imagined it. Nobody came out this far, not in weather that could freeze a man's lungs in his chest. He waited, holding his breath, but the knocks came again. 3 desperate thuds against the wood of his barn. Slowly he rose, the old floorboards groaning under his boots. He took his rifle from its rack more out of habit than intent. Out here, a knock in the middle of a blizzard could mean anything. Starving drifters, thieves, or worse. The wind nearly tore the door from his hands when he stepped outside. Snow stung his face, and the world beyond his porch was a white blur. He moved toward the barn, following the faint shape of it through the storm. His lantern light swung wildly, carving out brief ghosts in the darkness. When he reached the barn doors, he paused, every instinct telling him to turn back, to lock himself inside and let whatever was out there pass on. He didn't owe the world anything anymore. The world had taken everything it wanted from him. Then he heard it. Small voices, a cough, a whimper. He shoved the doors open. There, half buried in snow and trembling from cold, stood a girl who couldn't have been more than 17. Her shawl was soaked through, her cheeks raw and wind-burned. Behind her, 2 children huddled together, wide-eyed and silent. The girl looked up at him with the kind of fear that had nothing to do with the storm. "Please," she said, her voice cracking on the word. "Can we sleep in your barn, sir?" 6 words, simple, small, but they tore straight through the wall of grief he'd built around himself. For a heartbeat, Silas could only stare. He'd seen drifters before, miners, farmers run off their land, but something about this trio struck different. The girl stood between him and the children like a soldier, her thin body a barrier against the cold and the world itself. He swallowed hard. "You lost?" She nodded. "We were headed toward the settlement. Our horse went lame miles back. We walked till we couldn't anymore." Her lips trembled, but she held his gaze, refusing to beg again. The boy, no older than 8, was shaking violently. The little girl, maybe 6, was half asleep, her hands blue where they clutched her sister's skirt. Silas's first instinct was the same one that had kept him alive all these years. Don't get involved. The moment you start caring, you start losing. Still, he couldn't ignore the sound of the smallest child's shallow breathing. He'd buried a child once. He couldn't watch another die. He jerked his chin toward the door. "Inside. Quickly now." The girl hesitated, unsure whether this was mercy or a trap. But the look in his eyes, tired, worn, but not cruel, made the choice for her. She ushered the children into the barn. The warmth from the animals hit them like a wave. The old draft horses turned their heads, curious but calm, as Silas moved to light another lantern. "Thank you," she whispered. "We won't cause trouble, just till morning." He grunted in response, fetching a blanket from a trunk and tossing it toward her. "Get them warm. There's hay by the stall." As she knelt to wrap the children, Silas got a better look at her. Dirt streaked her face and exhaustion had carved deep shadows beneath her eyes, but there was a stubborn light still burning there. She wasn't beaten yet. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Nora Hale," she said. "These are my brother and sister, Ben and Clara. Where are your folks?" Her silence was answer enough. The boy looked up then, voice small. "Papa's gone. Mama too." Silas felt something twist inside his chest. He turned away before they could see it. "There's stew on the stove. I'll bring some." When he returned a few minutes later, Nora had managed to settle the children under the blanket. They were already half asleep, their breathing slow and even. She accepted the bowl of stew with shaking hands, but before eating, she handed it first to Ben, then to Clara. Only after they'd taken a few bites did she allow herself any. "You ain't eaten in a while," Silas noted. She smiled faintly. "Not enough for all of us. I can wait." He studied her for a long moment, the way her hands trembled but never faltered. She reminded him of Mary in the worst days of their ranch. Tired, proud, unbreakable. The wind screamed outside, slamming snow against the barn walls. Inside, the lantern burned steady. Silas leaned against the stall door, watching as Nora finally finished the last of the stew, her eyes already drooping. He should send them off come morning, he told himself. Point them toward town, give them a meal, maybe a blanket, that was all. Anything more was dangerous. Anything more was pain waiting to happen. But as he looked at the small forms curled in the hay and at the girl sitting upright as if she didn't trust sleep, a thought crept in uninvited. If he turned them out tomorrow, the storm would finish what hunger had started. He exhaled slowly, the sound heavy in the silence. "Get some rest," he said gruffly. "You're safe here for the night." Nora's eyes fluttered open long enough to whisper, "Thank you, Mr. Gentry." He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just turned down the lantern and listened to the storm. Each gust sounded like the breath of ghosts against the walls, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone inside them. As the storm begins to scream across the valley, Silas realizes his choice will decide whether these strangers live or die. If you want to know what fate awaits Silas and the strangers in his barn, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for the next chapter of this Western tale. Sometimes kindness begins as a lie meant to protect pride. The storm only grew crueler as the night deepened, howling like a wounded thing through the trees. Inside the barn, the air smelled of hay, horse sweat, and thawing snow. Silas Gentry moved with the stiff precision of a man who didn't want to admit what he was doing. He told himself he was being practical, not merciful. A dead child on his land would bring questions, maybe even the law, and he had no patience for that. So yes, he'd keep them alive until morning. It was logic, not charity. That's what he told himself every time his conscience tried to speak. Nora sat near the lantern's glow, her arms wrapped around her siblings. The boy, Ben, was trying not to cry, his teeth chattering so hard the sound mixed with the wind's whine. Silas noticed his bare feet, torn, bloody, and cracked with frostbite. The little girl's breathing was shallow, her face flushed from fever that had nothing to do with warmth. Silas crouched near them, studying the injuries without speaking. He'd seen frostbite before in cattle and in men, but on children, it hit different. Nora shifted, wary of his closeness. "We'll be fine," she said, her voice brittle with false strength. "We just need to rest a while. We'll move on when the weather clears." "You move on in this?" he muttered. "You'll freeze before you make it past the ridge." Her chin lifted, stubborn as a mule. "We've managed before." Silas didn't argue. He simply rose and crossed the barn to fetch the supplies he'd sworn he wouldn't use tonight. An old wool blanket, a half-full jar of salve, and a bottle of whiskey he kept for disinfecting wounds, or forgetting them. When he returned, Nora's expression was caught somewhere between suspicion and gratitude. "I don't need—" "It's for the boy," Silas interrupted. "Not you." She hesitated, then nodded and eased Ben's small foot into his lap. Silas poured a little whiskey over the torn skin. The child gasped and tried to pull away, but Nora held him steady, whispering comfort in his ear. The way she spoke, soft but unbreakable, reminded Silas of another voice, years ago whispering to calm a child that never made it through the night. He swallowed hard, focusing on his work. He rubbed the salve over the wounds with careful hands, then wrapped the feet in strips of linen torn from an old shirt. The boy finally sagged into his sister's arms, exhausted. "You've done this before," Nora said quietly, watching him. He shrugged. Took care of livestock most my life. Not so different. But they both knew it was a lie. There was a gentleness in his touch that didn't belong to a man who'd only known animals. Nora noticed it but said nothing. Pride held her tongue where gratitude wanted to speak. Silas moved to the little girl next, laying a hand against her forehead. She was burning up. He frowned. How long she'd been sick? Since yesterday, Nora whispered. She kept coughing then. She just wouldn't wake up proper. Silas hesitated only a second before stripping off his coat. Bring her inside the house, it's warmer there. Her eyes widened. We can't. You can, he said firmly. I ain't asking. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then she nodded and gathered the child into her arms. Silas opened the barn doors just wide enough for them to pass through, shielding the lantern flame from the wind. Snow lashed at their faces as they made their way across the short stretch to the farmhouse. Inside, the house was dark except for the faint glow from the stove. Silas set more wood on the fire until it roared. The heat began to fill the room, driving out the cold. He motioned to the cot near the wall. Lay her there. Nora obeyed, gently placing her sister down. She looked so young in that moment, not just her years but in her uncertainty. Like someone who'd never known safety long enough to believe in it. Silas fetched another blanket, draping it over both girls. He caught Nora's eyes then, saw the exhaustion etched deep in them. You can sit, he said gruffly. I'm fine. He arched a brow. You look about ready to fall over. Her lips twitched, a faint hint of humor breaking through the strain. Maybe a little. She sank into the chair by the fire. The warmth made color return to her face, and for the first time she didn't look ready to bolt. Silas turned away, busying himself with the kettle just to avoid the unfamiliar sight of another person in his home. The walls, once silent and heavy, now seemed to hum with something like life. He wasn't sure he liked it. When the tea was ready, he handed her a cup. Drink. It'll help. She accepted, her fingers brushing his for a second. Just long enough for both of them to feel the spark of contact. Why are you doing this? She asked after a long silence. He took a sip of his own tea, staring into the fire. Because it's the right thing to do. That's not an answer, she pressed. Plenty of people out there who'd have shut the door in our faces. He sighed. Then you were lucky I ain't most people. Her gaze softened a little. You're not half as cold as you pretend. He almost smiled at that. Almost. Don't be so sure. The wind battered the windows, but the house held. Slowly, the tension began to ease. Nora's siblings slept soundly, their small forms bundled together beneath the quilts. She stayed awake, watching Silas feed the fire. The lines on his face caught the light, deep grooves carved by grief more than time. You live here alone? She asked quietly. Been that way a while. What happened to your wife? The question hung in the air, fragile and uninvited. Silas froze, his hand halfway to the kettle. The firelight threw his shadow long across the floor like a man split in two. She died, he said at last. The words were flat, final. Nora hesitated. I'm sorry, was it childbirth? He finished for her. His voice was rough, the kind that carried memory in every syllable. She and the baby, both. I wasn't there. He set the kettle down hard enough to make it rattle, then turned toward the window, his back to her. Snow still fell outside, silent and relentless. Nora said nothing. She didn't offer the hollow sympathy most people would. Instead, she simply rose and set her hand gently on his arm. It was a quiet acknowledgement, not of his words, but of the weight behind them. For the first time in years, Silas didn't pull away. He let the touch stay there, light but grounding. The wind outside howled like a chorus of the dead. But in that small farmhouse there was warmth, a fragile peace born from shared pain. As Silas turned back toward the fire, Nora's voice came again, barely above a whisper. You said you weren't there when she died, she murmured. Where were you? Silas met her eyes, the truth heavy on his tongue. Drunk, he said softly. I was drunk when they both needed me most. Some storms come from the sky, others are born in memory. The blizzard raged through the night, screaming across the valley like the ghosts of the lost. Inside the small farmhouse, the world felt paused, trapped between the warmth of the fire and the icy violence just beyond the walls. Silas Gentry sat in his worn chair near the hearth, rifle leaning against his knee, eyes fixed on the flames as they licked and snapped in the darkness. Every flicker seemed to summon pieces of a night he had tried for 5 long years to forget. He'd thought he'd buried that memory alongside Mary and the baby, the night he failed them. But now, as Nora's soft breathing filled the quiet between gusts, the past rose again, uninvited. He saw it as clearly as if it were happening once more. The fevered panic, the shouting, the smell of whiskey on his breath. He hadn't meant to leave her alone that night. Mary had been strong, too strong for her own good, and she'd told him to go to town, to fetch the doctor. He'd done as she asked, but the roads were bad, and by the time he reached town, the doctor was gone, out on another call. So Silas did the only thing a desperate man could do. He went to the saloon to wait. 1 drink turned into 5, and by the time he stumbled home, dawn was bleeding across the snow and everything he'd loved was gone. The doctor's buggy tracks were still fresh in the frost outside the gate. The fire popped sharply, pulling him back to the present. He blinked and found Nora sitting across from him, her face illuminated by the glow. The exhaustion had softened her features, but her eyes remained watchful, alert, like someone who had learned never to sleep too deeply. Behind her, the 2 children lay curled together on the small cot, their chests rising and falling in steady rhythm. "You're still awake," she said quietly. He nodded. "Used to it. You're watching over us," she guessed. "Storm like this, someone should." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, measuring the man behind the quiet. She saw the hard lines of his jaw, the weariness that clung to him, and the gentleness he tried so hard to hide. "You don't sleep much, do you?" "Not if I can help it." Silas tried to sound indifferent, but his voice cracked on the last word. The truth was, sleep brought dreams, and dreams brought Mary, pale, cold, and silent with their child in her arms. He'd rather face 100 sleepless nights than see that vision again. Nora said nothing more, just studied the way the light danced against his face. Something in her chest ached, a mix of pity and something else, something dangerous. She recognized the look of a person who'd carried guilt too long. She'd seen it before, in her father, in herself. When Clara began to stir and cough, Nora rose instinctively, pulling the blanket tighter around the girl's shoulders. Silas moved beside her without a word, placing a fresh log on the fire to keep the room warm. "She'll be fine," he said softly. "Fever's breaking." Nora glanced at him. "You sure?" "I've seen enough sickness to know." She nodded slowly. "You talk like a man who's seen too much of everything." He didn't respond, but his eyes betrayed him. For a long time, they both stood in silence, listening to the wind claw at the windows. The fire threw shadows that danced across the walls, shapes that reminded Silas too much of the figures he saw in dreams. Finally, Nora sank into the chair opposite him. "You said your wife died in childbirth," she began carefully. "That must have been—" He didn't let her finish. "It was my fault." Her brow furrowed. "You can't know that." "Oh, I know," he said, voice low and raw. "I wasn't there. I was supposed to be, and I wasn't. Doesn't matter why. Doesn't matter that I couldn't change it. She died scared and alone because I didn't come home." The words dropped between them like stones into deep water. Nora's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that some things were just meant to happen. But what did she know of meant to be? Her own father had gambled away everything they had and died with a bottle in his hand. If fate had a plan, it was a cruel one. She leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching the glint of tears she tried to hide. "Maybe you can't fix what's gone," she said softly, "but you can choose what you do now." Silas met her eyes then, and for the first time he didn't see a child begging for mercy. He saw strength, determination, something that reminded him of the woman he'd lost and the man he used to be. "You talk like someone twice your age," he murmured. Nora smiled faintly. "Hard to stay young when the world keeps burning around you." Outside, the wind screamed louder as if echoing her words. The storm wasn't done, not by a long shot. Hours passed in uneasy quiet. Silas fed the fire, checked on the horses, and tried not to think too hard about how natural it felt to have others under his roof again. The laughter of children used to fill this house. Now the faint rhythmic breathing of two sleeping little ones filled that same space, gentler but just as alive. At one point Ben stirred, half awake, mumbling in his sleep. "Papa," he whispered, his voice fragile as glass. Nora brushed his hair back gently. "Shh, go back to sleep." But Silas had already turned away, jaw tightening. That one word, "Papa," cut deeper than any memory. He could almost hear Lily, his daughter that never lived, calling the same. Nora saw his reaction, her heart twisting in empathy. "He didn't mean—" "I know," Silas interrupted, his voice strained. "He's just a boy." The wind began to ease near dawn, the snow settling into heavy silence. Silas stepped outside briefly to check the drift, pulling his coat tight around him. The air was still sharp, but the worst had passed. The horizon glowed faintly pink, the promise of morning. When he returned inside, the world seemed softer somehow. Nora had dozed off in the chair, her head resting on her arm. In sleep, her face looked younger, stripped of the defiance she carried when awake. Clara and Ben were still asleep beside the fire, their cheeks flushed with warmth instead of fever. Silas stood there for a long while, just watching them. Something unfamiliar and fragile took root inside him. Something dangerously close to peace. He hadn't felt it since before Mary's death. It scared him how much he wanted to hold on to it. But peace never lasted long in Silas Gentry's life. As the first light of dawn crept through the frosted windows, the wind shifted again, bringing with it a low, distant sound. A warning. The storm wasn't done. Not the one outside, nor the one that had begun to stir inside his heart. He turned toward the fire and whispered almost to himself, "It's not over. Not yet." As dawn broke pale and trembling over the valley, Silas realized that the storm outside had merely been a reflection of the one inside him. And neither had passed. What happens when strangers start to feel like home? By morning, the storm had finally spent itself. The wind no longer screamed through the valley, but whispered over drifts piled high against the fences. The sun peeked through a sky the color of pewter, revealing a world washed clean and white. Silas Gentry stood at his window, the faint warmth of dawn on his face, and listened to the stillness. The silence after a storm was always the loudest. Every creak of wood, every sigh of the hearth felt sharper, alive. Behind him, the crackle of the fire was joined by the soft breathing of his unexpected guests. Nora had fallen asleep in the chair, her shawl slipping from one shoulder. Her hair, dark and tangled from the night before, framed her face in loose strands. The children slept beside her near the stove, curled together under the heavy quilt he'd pulled from the attic. For the first time in years, his house didn't feel empty. It felt lived in, messy, human, warm. He cleared his throat quietly, uncomfortable with the thought. It wasn't right to feel that way. They were strangers, nothing more. He was only helping them survive the winter storm. That was it. Still, as he ladled porridge into bowls and poured hot water over tea leaves, he couldn't help glancing their way, wondering how long it had been since any of them had eaten a meal cooked over a real fire. When the scent of oats filled the room, Nora stirred, blinking awake. For a moment she looked startled, unsure where she was. Then her eyes found him at the stove, and some of the fear eased. "You didn't have to," she began, voice hoarse. "Didn't do it for you," he said quickly, setting the bowls on the table. "Kids need to eat." Nora smiled faintly, half amused by his defensiveness. "You always talk like kindness is a crime." He looked away. "Old habit." She woke the children gently. Clara smiled sleepily at the sight of warm food, while Ben, though quiet, tried to sit up and help his sister. That's when Silas noticed the flush still burning on the boy's cheeks, the sluggish way he moved. He touched Ben's forehead and cursed softly under his breath. "He's hotter than he was last night," Silas muttered. "Fever's climbing." Nora's face paled. "It'll break soon. It has to." "Not in this cold barn it won't," he replied. Before she could protest, he was already gathering another blanket and stoking the fire higher. "He needs to be inside in the warm." Her shoulders stiffened. "We can't." "Can," he interrupted, "and will. People will talk," she said, voice rising with quiet desperation. "You know how they are out here. A man living alone, a girl my age." "Let them talk," Silas said flatly. "They always do." He lifted the boy into his arms before she could argue again. Ben was light, too light, his head lolling against Silas's shoulder. Nora followed as he carried him into the main room. The fire there was already blazing, and the warmth hit them like a living thing. Silas set the boy on the bed and tucked the blankets tight around him. Clara clung to her sister's skirt, wide-eyed. "I'll fetch more water," Silas said, reaching for his coat. "We'll cool him down, get the fever off." "Mr. Gentry," Nora started, her voice small now. "You don't owe us this." He paused, hand on the door latch. "Didn't ask if I did." When he returned with snowmelt and clean rags, Nora was kneeling beside her brother, whispering prayers under her breath. Silas crouched beside her without a word, dipping the cloth and laying it across the boy's forehead. Together they worked in quiet rhythm, changing the compress, coaxing sips of water, wiping sweat from the child's face. Hours passed that way. Outside, the day brightened and then began to fade again into a pale winter dusk. By the time Ben's fever broke, Nora's hands were trembling with exhaustion. Silas caught her wrist gently, stopping her. "He's breathing easier now. You should rest." She shook her head. "Not yet. You'll be no use to him if you fall over." His tone softened. "I'll keep watch." For a long moment she hesitated, studying him like she wasn't sure if she could trust the offer. Then slowly she nodded. "Wake me if he worsens." He gave a small nod. "I will." When she finally lay down beside Clara, sleep claimed her fast. Silas sat near the fire, rifle resting across his knees, watching the flames. The house, once a mausoleum of grief, now pulsed with life again. A girl's soft breathing, the occasional cough from the boy, the faint rustle of Clara's blanket. Sounds that should have been painful were instead grounding. He thought of Mary, her laugh, the way she used to hum while sweeping, the smell of bread in the oven. For years those memories had been weapons, cutting him whenever they surfaced. But tonight they came with something gentler, like the ache after a wound begins to heal. He turned toward the small cot. Nora had shifted in her sleep, one arm draped protectively over her sister. Even in rest, she guarded them. Her strength humbled him. There was something fierce and unyielding about her, a survivor in a world that chewed up girls like her and left them in the cold. The next morning, Ben's fever was gone. The boy woke hungry, asking if there was more porridge. Nora's relief was so sudden and fierce that she laughed, covering her mouth as if afraid of the sound. Silas found himself smiling too, though he turned quickly to hide it. They ate together, the four of them, at his table. Clara asked about the horses, and Silas answered patiently, describing their names and quirks. Ben listened with rapt attention, his spoon forgotten mid-air. Nora just watched, a faint wonder in her eyes, as if she couldn't quite believe this calm existed. When breakfast was done, she gathered the dishes, insisting on washing them despite his protests. "We've taken enough," she said. "Let me do something." He nodded, pretending to be annoyed but secretly grateful for the sound of running water and the clatter of dishes. Ordinary living sounds he hadn't heard in so long. Outside, the snow still covered everything in blinding white. It would be weeks before the roads cleared, maybe longer. He knew the town would talk once word spread that he was sheltering a young woman and 2 children. Out here, charity turned to scandal in the blink of an eye. But as he looked at the small family moving around his kitchen, Nora's quiet competence, Ben's smile, Clara's humming. Silas decided he didn't much care. For the first time in years, he felt purpose again. There was work to do, mouths to feed, people depending on him. The ghosts of the past didn't seem quite so loud when the house was full of warmth and sound. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the snow-capped hills, Nora stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself. The world outside glowed soft and silver under the fading light. Silas joined her there, saying nothing. After a long silence, she spoke. "We can't stay forever." Her tone was steady, but her reflection in the glass looked uncertain, almost wistful. He didn't answer. He only looked out over the valley, the place that had once been his prison and was now somehow his sanctuary. You could, he thought. You could stay forever. As the snow drifted quietly beyond the window, Silas turned away before she could see the hope in his eyes. A hope that frightened him more than the storm ever had. Sometimes the dead are not the only ones haunting a house. The winter thawed slow that year, like a wound reluctant to close. Snow still clung to the edges of the fields, and the mornings began in silence. But the house on the Gentry ranch no longer felt hollow. It had begun to breathe again. The air inside was warmer, touched with the faint scent of stew simmering or wood smoke curling from the hearth. The sound of small footsteps had replaced the echo of emptiness, and every corner carried traces of new life. Laughter, soft singing, and the quiet clatter of dishes that hadn't been used in years. Silas woke each day now to the hum of movement. Clara would chatter to the chickens outside while Ben tried to help chop wood that was half his size. Nora, always up before dawn, had taken to cooking breakfast, her hands steady even in the chill. He'd tried to protest the first few mornings. This was his house, his kitchen, but she'd silenced him with that stubborn look he was learning to recognize. "You took us in," she'd said. "Let me make myself useful." After that, he didn't argue. Watching her move around his kitchen felt strange, like seeing sunlight pour into a room that had been locked up too long. She worked with quiet confidence, humming a tune he didn't know. The sleeves of his late wife's apron were rolled past her elbows, and the sight stirred something in him he didn't know how to name. Comfort mixed with ache. At first he'd feared that letting them stay would bring only more reminders of what he'd lost. Instead, their presence eased the ghosts. The house that had once echoed with Mary's absence now pulsed with new rhythms. Clara's laughter seemed to chase away the shadows that had clung to the corners for years. Ben's questions filled the air with a kind of curiosity Silas hadn't heard since his own childhood. Even the sound of Nora's footsteps softened the quiet that used to weigh on him like guilt. One evening, as the fire burned low, Nora found him in the parlor, sitting in the old rocker that had belonged to Mary. He'd been staring at the mantel for some time, at the bare patch of dust where a small wooden toy horse once sat. It had been Lily's, the baby they'd lost before she'd ever had the chance to play with it. He'd thrown the toy into a chest years ago, unable to bear the sight of it. But now, sitting there with the warmth of the new family he'd stumbled into, he felt that same old ache stir again, only this time it didn't crush him. It asked to be faced. Nora lingered in the doorway, holding a folded blanket. "You look like a man chasing ghosts," she said softly. He smiled without humor. "You wouldn't be wrong." She set the blanket down and crossed to him. "Tell me about her," she said. He stiffened. "About who?" "Your wife, Mary." Silas's eyes dropped to the floor. "Ain't much to tell that's worth remembering." "I don't believe that," she said gently. "You talk about her like she's a wound, not a woman. Maybe she deserves more than that." For a long moment he said nothing. Then with a sigh he began. "Mary was fire, stubborn as they come. She wanted a family so bad she'd pray every night for a child. When she found out she was with Lily, I thought the whole world had finally forgiven me for something. But it didn't. She got sick early. Doc said she needed rest. I thought I was helping by working harder, but the night came and—" He trailed off, staring into the fire. "I wasn't here. I was too far gone in a bottle to hear her calling." Nora didn't look away. And you've been punishing yourself ever since. He nodded once, unable to speak. You can't live like that forever, she said. You can't keep shutting the door on every memory that hurts. You'll suffocate in your own silence. Her words landed like snowflakes, soft but heavy enough to stick. He wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand, but she did. He saw it in her eyes. The same kind of loss, carried quiet but deep. Later that night, while Silas was outside checking the barn, Nora searched the house for the wooden horse she'd seen once in the storage chest. She found it buried under folded quilts, its paint chipped and one leg cracked. She dusted it off carefully and carried it back to the parlor. When Silas came in, stamping snow from his boots, he froze at the sight of her standing by the mantel. She was holding the horse in her hands. "Thought this belonged here," she said, setting it back in its old place. His breath caught. The little toy looked small and fragile against the wood, but it changed the whole room, made it feel honest somehow, like both the past and present had been invited to stay. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the fire's soft hiss and the wind's sigh against the glass. "You didn't have to do that," he said finally. "I know," she replied, "but you needed it." He stared at her, the young girl who'd walked into his barn out of a blizzard and somehow turned his tomb of a house into something alive again. He wanted to thank her, but the words caught in his throat. Gratitude wasn't something he'd had to give in years. Instead, he reached out and rested his hand on the mantel beside hers. Their fingers brushed briefly. Warm, human, real. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life settled into something steady. Nora began mending his shirts, patching holes with surprising skill. The children grew stronger, their laughter ringing through the halls. Silas caught himself humming once while chopping wood, and when he realized it, he laughed out loud, a rough, rusty sound that startled even him. That night, after the children went to bed, Silas sat again in the parlor. Nora joined him, knitting by the firelight. The glow painted her face in gold, and for the first time he noticed how the shadows no longer haunted her eyes the way they once had. She looked peaceful here, maybe even happy. "Thank you," he said quietly. She looked up. "For what?" "For bringing the living back into this house." Nora smiled, soft but sure. "We didn't bring it back. It was waiting. You just had to open the door." He stared at her for a long moment, something shifting deep inside him. She wasn't just a reminder of what he'd lost. She was proof that he could still build something new, something good. That thought scared him more than any storm ever had, because it meant wanting again, and wanting meant risk. For the first time in years, Silas looked at Nora and felt something dangerous stir inside him. Not guilt, not grief, but hope. And hope, he knew, could destroy a man just as easily as it could save him. Heading 6. Whispers from the town. In small towns, gossip spreads faster than truth, and mercy is often mistaken for sin. By early spring, the valley had begun to thaw, and with it came the return of people and their tongues. Snowmelt turned the roads to rivers, carrying word from one ranch to another faster than any rider could. The talk began innocently enough, as it always did in small places like Alder Creek. Someone saw a young woman hanging laundry behind Silas Gentry's house. Someone else mentioned the sound of children's laughter drifting across his pasture. Before long, the story had grown legs and teeth. A widower, alone for 5 years, now keeping a girl young enough to be his daughter under his roof. By the time it reached town proper, the story had turned into a sermon. Reverend Marcus was the first to preach it, not from the pulpit, not yet, but in careful whispers behind the church walls. He spoke of appearances unbecoming of a godly man, his voice soaked in false pity. Banker Thomas Whitmore, always eager to twist rumor into leverage, listened keenly. Silas had borrowed money from him once long ago when Mary was alive. The debt was paid, but resentment, like interest, had a way of compounding. "Man like Gentry isolated that long," Whitmore muttered over brandy at the saloon. "You have to wonder what sort of company he keeps now." Back at the ranch, Silas knew nothing of the growing poison in town. His days were filled with chores, repairs, and the steady rhythm of new life. But Ezekiel, his oldest friend and ranch hand, rode in one morning with a grim look and mud up to his knees. "Town's got your name on its tongue, Silas," he said, brushing off his hat. "And not kindly." Silas set down the fence post he'd been driving into the thawing ground. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that turns neighbors into jurors," Ezekiel replied. "Marcus and Whitmore have been stirring folks up, saying you've lost your way, taking in that girl. They're calling her, well, calling her worse than a stray." A cold anger lit in Silas's gut. "She's 17, barely out of childhood. She came here starving with her siblings, and I took them in because nobody else would." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "I know that, and you know that. But gossip don't care much for truth. It only needs a spark. You keep her here through spring, and the whole damn town'll be convinced she's your mistress." Silas's jaw tightened. "Let them think what they want. I'm not turning them out to die for the sake of small minds." Ezekiel sighed, scratching his beard. "I figured you'd say that. Just watch yourself, old friend. Folks forget good deeds faster than they forgive broken rules." That night, as the children slept, Nora noticed the stiffness in Silas's shoulders as he sat by the fire. The light flickered against his face, catching the crease of worry he tried to hide. "Something's wrong," she said, not as a question but a knowing statement. He didn't look up. "Ezekiel was in town today. Says people are talking." Her hands stilled on the sewing in her lap. "About us." He finally met her gaze. "About you. About me. About things that ain't their business." She swallowed hard. "What are they saying?" He hesitated, unwilling to repeat it. But she saw it in his eyes, shame that wasn't his to carry. "They think I'm yours," she whispered. "That you're keeping me here for." Her voice broke before the words could finish. Silas stood abruptly, pacing toward the window. "I told you when you came here you were safe, and I meant it. You and the children aren't stepping foot outside this ranch till spring's done. Let the talk blow over." Nora rose too, anger sparking through the fear. "You think hiding will make it better? The more we stay shut in, the more they'll believe it." "I don't give a damn what they believe," he snapped. "I care about keeping you alive." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "Alive isn't the same as living, Silas." The fire cracked sharply between them. The air in the room was thick with everything unsaid. The loneliness that drove him to protect, the gratitude that kept her near, and the unspoken pull between them that neither dared name. After a long silence, he said quietly, "You could leave if you wanted. Take the children and go to the Hendersons. They'd take you in." "And then what?" she shot back. "Be a burden on them? Be pitied?" "No, thank you, I'll stay here. Not because I owe you, but because this is the first place that's felt like a home in a long time." Her words caught him off guard, cutting through his anger. She wasn't staying because she needed him. She was staying because she wanted to. That difference mattered more than he cared to admit. Outside, the wind carried faint echoes from the valley. The distant sound of hooves, a reminder that the world beyond their gate hadn't forgotten them. Silas moved to the window, scanning the ridge, just snow and shadow for now. But something about the air felt uneasy, like a storm building without clouds. The next morning, Ezekiel returned, his face grim. "Marcus ain't letting it rest. He's got Whitmore behind him, says the sheriff might come calling to ask a few questions." Nora, standing nearby, went pale. "The sheriff?" Ezekiel nodded. "They're saying it's indecent, that the children need proper guardianship. They'll make it sound righteous, but it's just cruelty dressed up in scripture." Silas clenched his fists. "Over my dead body." Ezekiel looked between them both, his voice dropping low. "They're planning to ride out tomorrow. A small group at first. Call it a visit. Best be ready." When Ezekiel left, the room fell silent again. Nora sat at the table, twisting the fabric in her hands. "Maybe we should go," she whispered, "before they come." "You're not running." Silas said, "I've done enough running for one lifetime. You can't fight the whole town." He leaned on the table, meeting her eyes. "I don't need to. I just have to stand long enough for them to see the truth." For a moment she saw it, the fire in him that had once built this ranch, the courage that grief had nearly buried. It stirred something in her chest, part admiration, part fear. That night the air turned heavy again, thick with the promise of confrontation. Silas cleaned his rifle not out of threat but ritual. Nora tucked the children into bed early, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the blankets. The fire burned low, painting the room in shades of gold and shadow. Neither of them slept. When the first light of dawn broke across the hills, Silas stepped out onto the porch, the cold air biting his face. From the distance came the faint, rhythmic thunder of hooves, slow at first, then growing louder. Dust and morning frost rose from the ridgeline as riders began to emerge one by one, their dark coats sharp against the pale horizon. Ezekiel's warning had been right. They were coming. As the riders drew closer, Silas felt Nora step onto the porch beside him. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried enough fear for both of them. "Those men aren't here to talk." He adjusted his grip on the rifle, eyes narrowing toward the oncoming line. "Then they'll learn we're not here to run. Sometimes justice wears a sheriff's badge. Sometimes it wears a sneer." By mid-morning, the sound of hooves had settled into the rhythm of inevitability. Dust rose from the trail like smoke from a slow-burning fuse, and Silas Gentry stood on his porch, watching the riders close the distance between the town and his ranch. Nora hovered just inside the doorway, her face pale but steady, her hand resting on the frame as though ready to shut it against the world if she had to. The children watched from behind her skirts, eyes wide and fearful. Silas had faced storms, wild horses, and starvation in his life, but this, the judgment of men who thought righteousness was theirs to measure, felt worse than all of it. There was no reasoning with men who'd already decided they were right. The first to dismount was Sheriff Dale, a man Silas had once called a friend. The badge on his chest gleamed, but his eyes looked weary, caught between duty and decency. Beside him stood Reverend Marcus, face pinched with moral outrage, and Thomas Whitmore, the banker, whose fine coat couldn't hide the satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. Behind them, 3 other riders lingered, townsmen hungry for gossip and spectacle. "Morning, Sheriff," Silas said evenly, though the tension in his shoulders gave him away. "Silas," the sheriff replied, his tone careful. "We're here to talk, that's all." "Talk, huh?" Silas's gaze flicked toward Whitmore and Marcus. "Seems to me those two don't come this far out of town just to talk." Marcus stepped forward, his boots crunching over the frosted ground. "You know why we're here. Word has it you've been keeping a young woman and 2 children under your roof for months. No kinship, no marriage, no proper supervision, the town's concerned about appearances, and the moral example being set." Silas laughed once, the sound low and bitter. "Appearances. That's what this is about? Not the fact that they were half dead when I found them?" Whitmore's voice cut through, smooth and venomous. "You expect us to believe your charity's pure, Gentry? A man alone for years suddenly takes in a pretty girl? People aren't blind." Silas's jaw flexed. "Careful, Thomas. Careful," Whitmore echoed, smirking. "You think your reputation's worth more than the truth? Everyone knows what goes on out here. She's not your wife, not your sister. What else is she supposed to be?" Before Silas could move, the sheriff lifted a hand. "Enough. Nobody's accusing anyone of crimes here. We just want what's proper. The girl and the children can stay in town. Mrs. Whitmore has offered to take them in until a more permanent arrangement can be made." Silas's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "They're not going anywhere." "Silas," the sheriff said gently, "you're making this harder than it needs to be. Nobody's saying you meant harm, but this situation, it looks bad. You're giving the town fuel." "Let them burn with it then," Silas snapped. "They're my responsibility now. I'll feed them, protect them, same as I've been doing." Marcus's face twisted in disgust. You've taken leave of your senses. That girl's not yours to protect. She needs the guidance of decent folk, not the company of a man drowning in sin and solitude. Decent folk? Silas took a step forward, his voice cold as steel. You mean the kind who whisper about orphans instead of helping them? The kind who'd rather see a girl freeze to death than share a roof? If that's your idea of decency, Reverend, I'll stick with my sins. Whitmore's smirk faded, replaced with a flash of anger. You're inviting trouble, Gentry. The town won't have it. You think you can stand alone against us? Done it before, Silas said flatly. The standoff stretched taut, every breath visible in the cold morning air. Finally, Sheriff Dale sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Silas, I'm not here to fight. But they'll push this to the judge if they have to. They'll claim unfit guardianship, immorality. Once that happens, you won't get a say. Silas glanced toward the doorway where Nora stood frozen. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tight. She looked like she wanted to disappear. When their eyes met, she shook her head slightly. Don't fight for me. But it was already too late for that. He turned back to the men. You tell them they'll have to go through me. I'm not handing her or those children over like cattle. The sheriff met his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I figured you'd say that. I'll do what I can to buy you time, but they won't stop here. Marcus scoffed, mounting his horse again. Stubbornness doesn't sanctify sin. You'll regret defying the church. Maybe? Silas said, stepping closer, voice low and lethal. But at least I can sleep knowing I didn't let 3 innocents die for the sake of your sermons. Whitmore sneered. You're finished, Gentry. Been finished for 5 years, Silas replied. Ain't stopped me yet. The men turned their horses, muttering among themselves as they rode back down the trail. The sheriff lingered a moment longer, giving Silas a look that carried both warning and pity. Then he followed them, leaving the ranch silent again, except for the ragged sound of Nora's breathing behind him. She stepped onto the porch, her voice trembling. You shouldn't have done that. He didn't turn. I wasn't about to let them take you. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. They'll ruin you, Silas. You've already lost so much. Your wife, your standing, your peace. I can't let them take what little you have left. He faced her then, eyes burning with a fierce calm. You think any of that matters to me? I've been living like a ghost for years. You and those children brought this place back to life. If the price of that is the town's hatred, I'll pay it gladly. Her tears fell then, hot against the chill air. We'll leave today, she said, before they can take anything else from you. Silas stepped closer, his voice soft but unyielding. Not today, not ever. Nora stared at him, searching for something in his face, a crack, a hesitation. But there was none. What she found instead was conviction, raw and terrifying. He wasn't protecting her out of pity anymore. He was standing with her because he'd chosen to. Inside, the children's laughter carried faintly from the back room, unaware of the storm gathering just beyond their walls. The same walls that had once sheltered ghosts now held something even more fragile. Hope. Silas looked out toward the horizon where the riders were vanishing into the distance, and knew the fight had only just begun. Behind him, Nora whispered through her tears, We'll leave before they destroy you. But Silas, still watching the empty road, said quietly, Let them come. I buried everything worth destroying long ago. Love sometimes begins as an act of defiance. The next morning dawned gray and uneasy, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. The house was quiet, too quiet. Nora moved about like a ghost, gathering the few things she and the children had brought with them when they arrived months ago. Her hands trembled as she folded Clara's dress, tucking it neatly into the small satchel. Every sound seemed to echo in the silence, the creak of the floorboards, the snap of the fire, the faint whistle of wind through the cracks. Silas stood in the doorway watching her, his heart heavy with something he couldn't quite name. The argument from the day before still hung between them like smoke after a fire. He had spent half the night sitting on the porch, staring into the black horizon, knowing the town would not stop at words. They would come again, soon, and this time with more than moral judgment. "Where are you planning to go?" he asked finally. Nora jumped slightly, then straightened. "Anywhere but here. The Hendersons will take us in for a while." "They might," he said quietly. "But the town won't leave you alone there either. Marcus and Whitmore won't rest till they see you shamed or gone." "Then we'll keep moving," she replied, her voice thin but steady. "It's what we've always done." Silas stepped closer, the firelight catching the silver in his beard. "You shouldn't have to run anymore." She froze, her back to him. "We don't have a choice." "You do," he said. And when she turned, she saw a look in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Something fierce, almost reckless. "There's one way to end this. One way to make them shut their mouths for good." Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" "Marry me," he said. The words came out steady, but his heart was pounding. "Let them see you not as some orphaned girl under my roof, but as my wife. Let them see we've chosen this, not stumbled into it." For a long moment, Nora could only stare at him. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious in my life." "You don't love me," she said quickly, shaking her head. "You barely know me. You're just trying to protect us." "Don't tell me what I feel," he interrupted, his voice low but sharp. "You think I haven't noticed how this house feels different now? How I breathe easier when you're near? How I can't walk into a room without looking for you first?" She took a step back, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Silas." He didn't stop. "You think I don't see you when you're teaching Clara to sew or reading to Ben by the fire? You think I don't know what it means to hear laughter in this house again after 5 years of silence? You've given me back something I thought I'd buried. I'm not asking you to love me back right now. I'm asking for a chance to keep you safe, to give those children a home." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "This isn't about me, it's about Mary. You're trying to make up for what you lost." Silas hesitated, her words cutting deep. "Maybe that's where it started," he admitted. "But that's not what this is now." He moved closer, his voice softening. "This is about the future, Nora. About choosing to live instead of just surviving." Nora's chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, but fear had a way of clinging to the heart. "What if I can't be what you need?" she whispered. "What if I'm too young, too broken, too—" "Perfect," he said, the word fierce and certain. "Exactly as you are." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Silas reached out, his rough hand trembling slightly as he brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. She caught his hand and pressed it against her face. Her skin was warm, her pulse racing beneath his fingers. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope. "If you mean it," she whispered, "ask me properly." Silas stared at her, then slowly went down on one knee right there in the parlor. The wood creaked beneath his weight, and his voice came out rough but sure. "Nora Hale," he said, taking her hand in both of his. "Will you marry me? Will you let me be a father to Clara and Ben and a husband to you? Will you stay here and build a life with me for as long as we both shall live?" Her breath hitched, tears spilling freely now. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking into a laugh. "Yes, you impossible, stubborn man, yes!" He stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as though afraid she might vanish like a dream. For a moment, all the fear and pain of the past fell away, replaced by something simple and steady. Joy. From the doorway came a small gasp, followed by a squeal. Clara stood there, eyes wide and shining. "You're getting married!" she shouted. "I knew it!" Ben peeked out from behind her, his expression uncertain. "Does that mean we get to stay?" Silas knelt, still holding Nora's hand. "If you'll have me," he said softly. "I'm not your father, and I'll never try to replace him. But I'd like to be your family if you'll let me." Ben didn't hesitate. He ran forward and threw his arms around Silas's neck. "I want you to be our papa," he said fiercely. I want us to stay forever." Clara joined the embrace, giggling, and Nora knelt too, wrapping her arms around them all. Laughter filled the room, real, unrestrained laughter, and for the first time since Mary's death, Silas felt whole. They stayed like that for a long moment, tangled together on the parlor floor, clinging to the fragile happiness they'd found. Outside, the snow had melted into streams that sang softly through the valley. Inside, the air was full of warmth and light. When the laughter finally quieted, Silas looked at Nora and whispered, "We'll do it soon, before the town can cause more trouble. We'll make it legal, permanent. Let them try to tear us apart after that." Nora nodded, her smile trembling. "They'll try," she warned. "Nothing worth having ever came easy," he said, a hint of a grin tugging at his lips. It was the first real smile she'd ever seen from him, and it broke something open in her chest, a feeling she hadn't dared to believe she could still have. But just as the warmth of the moment settled deep into their bones, a distant sound broke the peace, the sharp echo of hooves against frozen earth. Silas's smile faded as he rose, his hand going instinctively to the rifle propped by the door. Through the window he saw dust rising on the road, riders cutting across the valley. Ezekiel stepped onto the porch, his voice grim. "They're back," he said, "and they've brought company." Silas's jaw tightened. "Whitmore," he muttered. Nora's hand found his, fingers cold and shaking. "What do they want now?" He looked out toward the approaching figures, his eyes narrowing. "Trouble," he said, "and they've brought it in writing." As the sound of horses filled the air, Silas turned to Nora and said quietly, "Stay with the children. Whatever happens next, don't be afraid." But in her gut, Nora already knew. Fear was the only thing the town had left to give them. Sometimes family is forged in the barrel's shadow. The morning came cold and still, the kind of cold that carried warnings in its silence. A faint mist clung to the valley floor, veiling the pasture in ghostly silver. Silas stood on the porch, his rifle resting against his arm, watching as a line of riders cut across the field with grim purpose. He knew the moment he saw them, this wasn't a visit. It was judgment come on horseback. Nora appeared behind him, holding Clara's hand, her face pale but steady. "Is it them?" she asked. "It's them," Silas said quietly, eyes fixed on the approaching figures. Whitmore, Marcus, and the sheriff brought company too. He could count at least 4 more men behind them. 2 strangers dressed too clean to be ranch hands. Lawyers, maybe. Or enforcers hired by the banker to look official. Either way, trouble rode in their saddlebags. "Take the children inside," Silas said, his tone calm but firm. Nora hesitated. "I'm not hiding." "Not hiding," he said, glancing back at her. "Protecting." Before she could answer, the riders reined in a few yards from the porch. Sheriff Dale raised a hand in greeting, though his face looked anything but friendly. "Morning, Silas," he said, his breath steaming in the cold. "Sheriff." Whitmore dismounted with practiced ease, his polished boots sinking into the frost-hardened ground. "We've come to settle a few matters," he said, his tone oily and rehearsed. "Legal matters." "Then state your business from there," Silas replied. The rifle remained cradled casually in his arm, not aimed, but not forgotten. Whitmore smirked. "You think standing there with that gun makes you a law unto yourself? We've got papers, signed by the court, regarding the late Thomas Hale's debts and the guardianship of his children." He nodded to one of the strangers, who pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. Nora stiffened at the name. "Debts?" she whispered. Whitmore heard her. "Your father owed quite a sum before he passed. I've been more than patient. But debts don't die with the debtor. You're old enough to take responsibility, Miss Hale. Unless, of course, you've already arranged another form of payment." His smirk deepened. Silas's jaw tightened. "Watch your mouth." The banker ignored him. "We're here to collect what's owed. Failing that, the law entitles me to assume custody of the minors until the matter's resolved." "Like hell it does," Silas growled. The sheriff shifted uneasily in his saddle. Silas, don't do anything foolish. Let's just talk this through. I'm done talking, Silas said. You're not taking those children. You're not laying a finger on Nora. That's the only truth you need to hear. Whitmore scoffed. You've no claim to them. No marriage, no legal guardianship, no right. Wrong, Silas said evenly. As of yesterday, I filed the papers in town. Adoption petitions for both children. They're under my protection now. You want to challenge that, take it to a judge. That was a lie. He hadn't filed a thing. But he delivered it with such calm certainty that even the sheriff blinked in surprise. Whitmore faltered, the smirk slipping. You're bluffing. Maybe, Silas said, shifting the rifle slightly. You want to test it? The lawyer beside Whitmore cleared his throat. Even if that were true, the debts still stand. Then I'll settle them right now. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. Inside was nearly everything he had left in savings. $200, full payment for every dime Thomas Hale ever owed you. Whitmore's eyes flickered with greed, but pride won out. You think money erases scandal? The town already knows you've been keeping this girl. Paying her debts will only confirm what we all suspect. She's been living as my fiancée, Silas said, voice hard as iron. We're to be married this Sunday. So whatever filth you've been spreading, you can swallow it and choke. The sheriff blinked. Married? Does Reverend Marcus know about this? Marcus, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke, his voice trembling with self-righteous anger. This is a mockery of God's law. A widower twice her age marrying a girl barely grown. It's indecent. Indecent? Silas barked a laugh. You'd rather see her starve in the snow because it looks neater on paper? You call that decency? The tension thickened until even the horses shifted uneasily. Ezekiel can marry us, Silas continued, pressing the bluff. He's ordained, certified by the territory. We'll hold the ceremony here on my land with witnesses enough to satisfy any court. Marcus turned red. Ezekiel? That old ranch hand? He's no preacher. Got the papers to prove otherwise, Silas lied smoothly. But I reckon you'd rather argue with the law than the Lord, Reverend. The lawyer leaned toward Whitmore. If what he says is true, we can't touch them until the marriage is challenged in court. Whitmore's glare turned venomous. You're protecting a sinner. Gentry, when this ends, the town will turn its back on you. They already did, Silas said. Didn't notice I kept breathing. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Sheriff Dale exhaled, the plume of his breath white in the cold air. All right, he said quietly. This isn't the time or place for a fight. We'll take this to the judge. Whitmore turned his horse with a final glare. Enjoy your little playhouse, Gentry. It won't last. Silas didn't lower his rifle until the riders were distant shapes disappearing into the morning mist. Only then did he let out a long breath, his hand trembling slightly as the adrenaline ebbed. Behind him the door opened, and Nora stepped out. You told them we're engaged, she said softly. I did. And you said the children are adopted. I did that too. Her voice wavered. Neither of those things are true. He turned to her, the hard lines of his face softening. Maybe not yet, but they will be. She stared at him wide-eyed, the enormity of his words settling between them like something sacred. You'd really do that? Marry me? Take them in for good? He nodded slowly. I meant what I said. This family's mine now, Nora. Not because I owe you, but because I want to. Because I've spent 5 years waiting for a reason to live again. And when you knocked on my barn door, I found it. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She stepped closer instead, her hand finding his arm. The air between them hummed with something unspoken, something fragile and fierce all at once. They stood together in silence, watching the last of the riders vanish into the distance. The world felt suspended, quiet, heavy with the promise of change. Finally, Silas lowered his rifle and whispered almost to himself, I may have lied about the marriage, but now I mean to make it true." Nora's breath caught, her heart pounding with equal parts fear and something dangerously close to hope. The vows were simple. The courage behind them was not. The week that followed felt like the calm before a gunfight. Too quiet, too perfect, the kind of peace that made a man uneasy. Silas worked from dawn till dusk, mending fences, splitting wood, pretending that labor could quiet his thoughts. But it couldn't. Every time he looked at Nora, he felt the weight of the promise he'd made. One born from desperation, but now rooted in something far deeper. He meant every word. Ezekiel arrived 3 days later, his horse steaming from the long ride and his face marked with the quiet gravity of a man who'd seen the worst of both men and weather. He listened in silence as Silas explained what had happened. The confrontation, the bluff, the lie turned into truth. When Silas finally finished, Ezekiel rubbed his jaw thoughtfully and said, "So you want me to marry you two this Sunday?" "That's right. You know what kind of fire that's gonna light in town." "I know," Silas said, "but it's the only way to end this. I won't have them tearing her apart because of me." Ezekiel studied him for a long moment, then looked toward the house where Nora was teaching Clara her letters by the firelight. "You love her?" Silas didn't hesitate. "Yeah, I reckon I do." That was all Ezekiel needed to hear. "Then I'll do it," he said finally. "Never thought I'd preach a wedding, but there's a first for everything." Word spread fast, as it always did. Within 2 days, the entire valley knew that Silas Gentry, the man who'd lived like a ghost for 5 years, was marrying the orphan girl he'd taken in. The news split the town clean in two. Some called it salvation, a story of grace and new beginnings. Others called it indecent, a scandal fit to poison the moral well of Alder Creek. Mrs. Henderson, whose heart was bigger than most men's courage, rode out the next morning with a basket of fabric and her sewing kit. "You can't get married in rags," she declared, bustling into the house before Nora could protest. "We'll make something fitting but proper. Cream wool, practical and beautiful, just like you." Nora tried to argue. "I don't have money to pay you back." "Hush," Mrs. Henderson said, waving her hand. "Consider it my tithe to decency, since the Reverend's forgotten what that means." While the women worked, Ben disappeared into the barn for hours. When he returned, his hands were blistered, his hair full of hay, and his eyes bright with pride. "Made something," he announced, holding out his small palms. Resting there were 2 copper rings, rough, uneven, but shining. "Ben," Nora gasped softly. How? "Papa showed me how to twist wire once," he said. "Said if you do it right, it won't break." Silas's throat tightened as he took the rings. They weren't much, but somehow they felt truer than gold. "They're perfect," he said, and Ben beamed. By Sunday morning, the world outside looked washed clean. The frost had melted into a silver mist that hung low across the land, and the first birds of spring called from the trees. The house glowed with firelight and the low hum of voices. Ezekiel stood near the hearth, Bible in hand, his rough suit brushed clean for the occasion. Neighbors came, quietly, cautiously. The Hendersons, of course, Doc Hartwell. Old Mrs. Doyle, leaning on her cane and muttering that she wouldn't miss the chance to see the only real love story left in this miserable town. Others came out of curiosity, not courage, but still they came. When Nora stepped out of the bedroom, every sound in the parlor stopped. She wore the cream wool dress Mrs. Henderson had made, simple but elegant, the fabric hugging her slender frame. Her dark hair fell loose over her shoulders, and in her hands she carried a small bouquet of evergreens and wild sage, symbols of endurance and cleansing. Silas forgot how to breathe. She wasn't a frightened girl anymore. She looked like someone stepping into her own strength. Ezekiel's voice filled the room, deep and steady. "We're gathered here today to witness the union of Silas Gentry and Nora Hale," he began. "Now, I'm not much for fancy sermons, but I do know this. Love ain't about perfection. It's about choosing life when it would be easier to keep dying. These 2 people have chosen to live, and that deserves to be blessed." He turned to Silas. Do you take this woman to be your wife? To stand by her, protect her, and choose her every day for as long as you live? I do, Silas said, the words strong and clear. Then to Nora, do you take this man to be your husband? To trust him, to build with him, to walk beside him even when the road gets hard? Nora swallowed, her eyes bright. I do, Ezekiel nodded. The rings. Ben stepped forward, his small hands trembling as he held them out. Silas took the larger one and slipped it onto Nora's finger. With this ring, he said softly, I thee wed. Nora placed the smaller ring on his finger, her voice barely above a whisper. With this ring, I thee wed. Ezekiel's smile creased his weathered face. Then by the power vested in me by the Montana Territory, and by the good Lord who sees the truth of hearts even when men refuse to, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The room erupted in quiet joy. Clara clapped her hands, Ben whooped out loud, and Mrs. Henderson dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Silas took Nora's face in his hands and kissed her gently, reverently. When they pulled apart, there was laughter, real, unguarded laughter. The parlor filled with warmth and chatter. Ezekiel poured cider, Doc Hartwell played his fiddle, and even Silas found himself pulled into a slow, awkward dance that made Nora laugh until she cried. For the first time since the blizzard that brought them together, it felt like the world had righted itself. But joy has a way of drawing darkness to its door. It began with the sound of hooves again. At first no one noticed. The music and laughter drowned it out. Then Clara's face turned toward the window, her expression freezing. Papa, she whispered, there's men outside. Silas's hand dropped from Nora's waist as he turned toward the door. Through the window he saw them. Riders, more than before. A dozen at least. At their head rode Reverend Marcus, black coat whipping in the wind, and beside him Thomas Whitmore with a rolled paper in hand and vengeance in his eyes. The laughter died. The fiddle fell silent. Ezekiel set his Bible down with a sigh. Guess the Lord's work never gets done. Silas reached for his rifle, his face hardening. Stay with the children, he told Nora. But Nora shook her head, fear and defiance battling in her eyes. Not this time. I stand with you. The door swung open as the riders dismounted, boots crunching on the frozen ground. Reverend Marcus's voice rang out like a sermon of doom. This marriage is illegal, he thundered, and before the day is done, it will be undone. Silas stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, his new wife behind him, and the war for their family truly began. Some battles are fought without guns but still risk everything. The sound of hooves and boots crunching over the frost was louder than thunder in the stillness. Every window of the Gentry house flickered with candlelight, casting long shadows that trembled against the walls. Inside, Nora stood close to Silas, her hand resting against his back as if her touch could steady him. The laughter that had filled the house moments before had been replaced by a tense, dreadful quiet. Outside, the voices of the men grew sharper, their words hard as stones thrown at glass. Reverend Marcus was the first to speak, his voice slicing through the night air. Silas Gentry, you've broken the sanctity of this community. This farce of a marriage will not stand. The church does not recognize it. Silas stepped out onto the porch, the rifle resting loosely at his side. The church doesn't own my life, he said evenly, and it sure as hell doesn't own my family. Behind Marcus, Whitmore swung down from his horse, his face flushed with the self-righteous fury of a man who'd come to win, not reason. He unrolled a document with a dramatic flourish. By order of the Territorial Court, he declared, we're here to enforce the collection of outstanding debts and seize guardianship of the Hale children pending review. The crowd that had followed them from town, a mix of farmers, merchants, and gossips, shifted uncomfortably. Some had come to see a scandal, others to see a man's ruin. All stood silent as Silas's jaw tightened. I already paid those debts, Silas said. Full amount in cash to your associate Burton 3 days ago. Signed and witnessed. Whitmore blinked, his confidence faltering. That's impossible. Is it? Silas reached into his coat and pulled out the folded paper he'd kept close since that day. I keep my receipts, Thomas. You might be surprised how honest some of your men get when you pay them what you owe. He tossed the paper toward the sheriff, who caught it neatly. Sheriff Dale unfolded it, his brows drawing together as he read. Bill of sale, signed by a J. Burton. Payment received in full. He looked up, his tone firm. That's legal, Whitmore. The banker's face went red, then pale. He had no authority to accept payment. Ezekiel, standing at Silas's right, stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying. Authority or not, that's your man's signature, witnessed by 2 others. You can't claw back what's been settled. A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. Marcus, realizing Whitmore was losing ground, raised his voice again. Legalities aside, this union itself is invalid. The girl's underage. The ceremony performed by an unqualified man. This isn't marriage. It's sin dressed in scripture. Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. You questioning my right to speak God's words, Reverend? Marcus sneered. You're no ordained minister. Ezekiel calmly reached into his coat and produced a worn, folded document. Certified by the Montana Territory 15 years past, he said, handing it to Sheriff Dale. Never had cause to use it till now. Guess the Lord was saving me for something worth standing up for. The sheriff examined it, then nodded slowly. It's legitimate. The tension rippled through the onlookers. A few exchanged uncertain glances. Others whispered to one another, weighing the law against the preacher's fury. Marcus's voice grew shrill. And the girl, 17! She can't consent without a guardian. Territorial law says otherwise, came a new voice. Doc Hartwell pushed his way forward, his spectacles glinting in the firelight. 17's the age of consent here, provided there's witness and free will, which I heard with my own ears. He nodded toward the door where Nora stood, pale but steady. She said, I do, Reverend, and I'll swear to it in court if I must. Marcus sputtered. You would stand against the church? I'd stand for decency, the doctor said. Something you might revisit. A few people in the crowd laughed quietly. It was the first crack in the Reverend's authority. Then from near the back of the group came the creak of an old cane. You men done yet? The voice was gravel and wind. Mrs. Doyle, the oldest resident of Alder Creek, wrapped in her shawl, her gray hair gleaming like frost under the lamplight. The crowd parted as she hobbled forward. Because I've heard enough foolishness for one night. Marcus turned, startled. Mrs. Doyle, with all respect, this is a matter of law and morality. Oh, hush, she said sharply. You've been talking about morality since you learned to hold a Bible right side up. This man, she nodded at Silas, took in orphans when no one else would, fed them, clothed them, and now he's made them family in the eyes of God and man. And you, she pointed her cane at Marcus, you'd rather see them scattered and broken so your sermons don't sound like lies. The crowd went still. You think I don't remember what it's like to be talked about? She went on. Lost my husband at 20. Raised 2 children alone. Folks called me everything but blessed, and not a one of them lifted a finger to help. You know who did? Men like Silas Gentry. Even those who'd come to gawk began to nod, their expressions softening. Mrs. Henderson called out from near the porch. She's right. Some of us still remember what it means to be neighbors. Amen to that, Doc Hartwell added. Sheriff, Dale looked over the assembled crowd, then at the Reverend and the banker still fuming beside him. Seems to me, he said slowly, this man's done everything right by law and decency both. Paid his debts, married his wife fair and witnessed, children safe under his roof. Don't see what business it is of anyone else's. Marcus's mouth opened, but no sound came. Whitmore looked ready to explode, but the lawyer tugged at his sleeve, murmuring something about letting it go. The sheriff tipped his hat. I'm calling this settled. The man's got a right to his family. With that, he turned his horse toward town. One by one, the crowd began to follow, their whispers soft but not cruel now, curiosity giving way to respect. Marcus lingered a moment longer, his face twisted in bitterness. "This isn't over," he hissed. Silas met his glare evenly. "No," he said quietly. "It's just beginning." When the last of the riders disappeared into the dusk, silence fell over the ranch again. Nora stepped out beside Silas, her hand slipping into his. Her voice trembled. "We won?" He nodded slowly. "For today." She leaned against him, exhausted but glowing. Inside, the children's laughter returned like sunlight after a storm. Ezekiel poured cider again, his voice carrying a note of weary pride. "You didn't just win a fight, Silas," he said. "You won yourself a life back." Silas looked at Nora, his wife now in every sense, and realized the old man was right. But peace, he knew, was its own kind of battle. As the fire burned low and the night settled quiet again, Nora whispered, "We fought to keep this family. Now we have to learn how to live as one." Silas glanced toward the glowing windows where laughter met the wind and answered softly, "That's the hardest fight of all." 6 words began it all. 6 words rebuilt a life. The valley turned green again before anyone noticed it had shed its winter. The snow melted into memory, the ground softened, and the sound of running water returned to the creek that had lain frozen so long. Spring folded quietly into summer, and life, real, breathing, joyful life, bloomed across the Gentry ranch like wildflowers after a storm. The house that had once felt too large for one man now fit 4 souls comfortably, and soon enough, it would need to fit 5. Nora's belly swelled beneath her calico dress, and the children hovered protectively near her like twin shadows of devotion. Clara brushed her mother's hair in the evenings while Ben fetched water and firewood without being asked. There was laughter at every meal, soft singing at bedtime, and even the quiet moments, the ones filled with nothing but the sound of wind and breath, felt alive. Silas had never known such peace. He still rose before dawn, but now he did it not to escape his thoughts, but to greet the day. Each sunrise felt like a promise kept, each sunset a prayer answered. When he looked at Nora moving about the kitchen, her hands deft and sure, or at the children chasing each other through the grass, he felt something inside him he hadn't dared to feel in years. Gratitude. Life on the ranch took on a rhythm of its own. Ben grew strong, learning to ride and rope under Silas's patient eye. Clara proved gentle and clever, always humming as she helped Nora in the garden. Ezekiel still stopped by every Sunday for supper, bringing stories, laughter, and more than once, a quiet word of advice when Silas wrestled with his new role as husband and father. "You don't earn family," Ezekiel had told him once. "You show up for it every day, that's all." And Silas did. But joy, he found, had its own kind of fear hiding in its shadow. The day Nora told him she was with child, he froze, half elation, half terror. For a moment his heart forgot how to beat. The memory of Mary's death still lay deep in him, buried but not gone. He looked at Nora then, her hands resting gently over the life inside her, and all the ghosts came rushing back. "What if," he started, voice breaking. She stopped him with a hand to his chest. "Then we'll face it. Together." He tried to smile, but his throat was tight. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple," she said softly. "It's just not easy." That night he sat awake beside her, listening to the rhythm of her breathing. The thought of losing her, of losing another child, felt unbearable. But somewhere in that long stretch of darkness, the truth dawned clear as morning light. He wasn't meant to protect his family from every pain. He was meant to love them through it. When the baby finally came, the world outside was blanketed once more in snow, the first snow of the next winter. Doc Hartwell arrived before dawn, grumbling about icy roads and stubborn mothers. Silas did everything the doctor told him, though his hands shook with every task. Nora's cries echoed through the small house, breaking him open in places he hadn't known were still fragile. And then, silence. followed by the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. A newborn's cry, sharp and insistent, demanding to live. "It's a girl," the doctor said, his lined face breaking into a smile. "Strong lungs, too." Silas stood frozen, afraid to breathe, until Nora looked up at him with tears shining in her eyes. "She's here," she whispered. "Silas, she's here." He knelt beside the bed, his calloused hand trembling as he touched the tiny bundle in Nora's arms. The baby's skin was pink, her fingers impossibly small. She yawned, stretching one hand toward his chest as if claiming him without hesitation. "What'll you name her?" Doc Hartwell asked. Silas swallowed hard. "Rose," he said after a long pause. "Rose for new beginnings." Nora smiled faintly. "Rose Lily," she added, "for what's new, and for what we lost." Silas nodded, unable to speak. He held his daughter close, the warmth of her small body seeping into him like sunlight through frost. For the first time since Mary's death, he wept. Not from grief, but from release. Every scar, every regret, every moment he'd believed his life was over dissolved into the sound of that tiny heartbeat against his chest. The days that followed were soft and slow. The house smelled of cedar and milk, laughter and life. Clara and Ben took turns watching over their baby sister, each insisting they could make her smile first. Even Ezekiel cried when he saw the child, muttering something about God working miracles in stubborn men. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Silas would wake to find Nora sitting by the window with the baby in her arms, humming the same lullaby she'd once sung to calm her brother and sister. The sight never failed to undo him. He'd stand there, watching her, remembering the girl who had knocked on his barn door one frozen night, asking for shelter. "Can we sleep in your barn, sir?" she had said. 6 words that had changed everything. He would never forget how small and uncertain she had looked, wrapped in threadbare clothes, her voice trembling but determined. He'd thought he was saving her then. Now he knew the truth. She had saved him. One evening, months later, he took Nora out to the barn where it had all begun. The air was thick with the scent of hay and horses, the same as that night so long ago. Only now, it smelled like memory, not loneliness. "You remember?" he asked. Nora laughed softly. "How could I forget? I thought you were going to chase us off." "I almost did," he admitted, smiling faintly. "Didn't know then that opening that door was the best thing I ever did." She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "You gave us a home," she said. He shook his head. "No, Nora. You gave me one." They stood there a while longer, listening to the creak of the rafters and the soft sounds of their new life unfolding. Ben's laughter in the distance, Clara calling for supper, the baby's faint cooing from inside the house. Silas tightened his arm around her. "You know," he said, voice low, "I used to think the worst thing that ever happened to me was losing Mary. But maybe it was just the beginning of the road that led here." Nora looked up at him, eyes glistening in the lantern light. "You found us," she said simply. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No," he whispered. "You found me." That night, as snow began to fall again over the valley, Silas stood in the doorway of the barn, looking out over his land. The same land that had once felt like a grave. Now it felt like home. He heard Nora's laughter drift from the house, warm and alive, and his heart swelled with the quiet certainty of a man redeemed. He remembered her voice from that night, small and trembling in the dark. "Can we sleep in your barn?" And he realized with a smile that reached his soul that when he said yes, Silas Gentry hadn't just opened his door. He had said yes to life itself. If Silas Gentry's journey from lost to love touched your heart, don't ride off just yet. Hit that like button to keep these Western tales alive, and share this story with someone who believes in second chances. Tell me in the comments, what moment hit you the hardest in Silas and Nora's story? And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for more epic frontier stories of courage, love, and redemption. The next tale's already saddled and waiting. You won't want to miss it.